Thank you everyone for joining today. This is the first episode of our Attack and Defense webinar series where we take lessons learned from our customers and other organizations that we work with and bring them forth so we can share best practices and lessons learned. Today we'll be talking about business email compromise and fraud. I'm your host, Michael Argus. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Kobalt. If at any time during the webinar you have questions, you can use the Q&A tab or button on your Zoom session. We are also recording this webinar for future sharing, and there's a few poll questions during the webinar. When we gather the data in the poll questions, it is completely anonymized. So thank you very much for joining today, and apologies in advance. Ironically, I came into my office so that I would have a nice quiet place to do this webinar today. There's nobody else here, but unfortunately, this is the time that some construction has decided to be done on our roof. So you may hear a little bit of grinding and thumping noises, and hopefully it is not too distracting as I'm going along. So thank you for joining, and we'll get started. So today I'm going to be covering a few different topics. First, I'm just going to give a brief primer on business email compromise and fraud, so you have a good understanding of the background, what it looks like, what the type of attacks look like. And then I'm going to cover 3 different real-world stories. The first 2 involve business email compromise alone and kind of the ramifications and consequences of that. The third story is, in fact, a business email fraud story that involves a payment heist of $150,000. And then I'm going to talk about defense strategies. And so that's what our agenda is today, and looking forward to diving into it. So business email compromise is really all about hijacking email accounts. And this has been going on for a long time, and it's become more prolific, and especially in the post-COVID days, we're seeing a lot more attacks against our customers and other organizations that we are called into to help clean up messes from. So there's a few common methods that are used. Classically, phishing and spear phishing attacks, where email message is sent to the recipient and it is used to capture their credentials. Very common generic phishing attacks used to just capture usernames and passwords to a whole bunch of people. Spear phishing, where a message is much more specifically crafted with the recipient in mind, possibly coming from somebody they know or in context, often attempting or posing to be your IT department. Credential stuffing attacks are significantly on the rise, and you see these specifically spike whenever there is a large compromise of a significant online service. So for example, if Facebook or LinkedIn or one of the other services has a large number of credentials stolen through some compromise, often attackers will start mass attempting to use those credentials in all sorts of different online services as a way of attacking and getting access to those services. And email accounts specifically are great targets for credential stuffing because, unfortunately, still in 2020, many people still have not learned not to use the same username and password for their email accounts as they do for other services. And then malware being a third very common scenario, where the recipient, through either again, a phishing attack or an email attack or some other method, has their laptop or device compromised, and through that compromise, their email account is then compromised as well. So let's talk a little bit about why attackers like to target email accounts. People don't necessarily think of email accounts as being one of their most sensitive and most important accounts, but time and time again, we've seen that it is. And one of the reasons to consider email very critical is that most of the accounts for your online services fundamentally use email as a password recovery and account management tool. So, if you've got your Gmail account or your O365 account and you go to sign on for an online service, when you need to reset the password of that online service because you've forgotten it or you've gotten locked out of your account, inevitably that will be sent as a message to your email for an account recovery. And so if I can compromise your email account, I can compromise many other services that you have access to. Another thing that people often don't think about is the fact that over the years, a ton of sensitive data is inevitably held within your email accounts. And so this could be, correspondence with others. If you're a financial officer, think about all the financial records that might be held. If you're an HR person, it could be HR records, social insurance numbers. The list goes on and on and on. And so, if I get access to your email account, not only have I got a pivot point for other services and systems that you have access to, but the account itself often has a tremendous amount of valuable data. And then lastly, email account is a tremendously valuable tool for more sophisticated attacks, including specifically business email fraud. And we see this quite a bit. So usually when you start to suffer business email fraud, somebody's actually already been inside of your business through a compromised email account for some period of time, waiting and trying to find a way to leverage that account to make additional money. And so, an email account being compromised is often the first step into a much more significant compromise down the road. So here's some examples of confidential data commonly found in email accounts. HR records, your own personal financial details and confidential records. So it could be, if you have to fill out a declaration form with your employer around payroll, or, your void check details, this sort of stuff. These sorts of details are often contained within your own email account. A variety of corporate data, typically client lists, vendor lists, employee lists. I don't go into it specifically in this webinar, but vendor lists and client lists are actually very valuable for pivoting into other forms of attacks. For example, if I know that you work with a specific vendor and I want to conduct business email fraud, and I have your vendor list, then I can go through your email and I can look for exchanges with those vendors, and I can look for invoice type information, and I can use that as a pivot point to launch further attacks. And then corporate espionage as well. Recent studies have shown that up to 60% of the intellectual property of an organization is typically held within somebody's email accounts as it's exchanged with third parties or internally, marketing plans, legal documentation. So there's a whole bunch of very valuable data held within email accounts. So I'm going to start with our first poll. And, as I mentioned, again, this is entirely anonymized. So if you could take a second to indicate which of these sorts of records you think are held within your corporate email accounts, that would be fantastic. We'll give that a few seconds. And you can choose multiple items. Okay, we've got responses from most people, but just a few more to finish. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to just end that poll and share the results. So you can see here that many of you believe that you contain contracts and agreements. And again, that's very, very common. Passwords for other accounts. And this is often in clear text. One of the things that for me as a security professional, I always get annoyed about is when I'm resetting a password, the online service, and it sends me the password back in clear text. I know that they've then been storing it in a way that's recoverable and therefore insecurely. And so that's kind of a personal annoyance of mine. Client data, vendor data, personal financial info. Great that nobody believes they have health record information in their email. Hopefully none of you have been exchanging, for example, when you're setting up benefits plans or that kind of stuff. Often those contain records and attachments. Fortunately, more of the benefits providers are starting to go to online portals, which means that it's not stored within email. One of the big challenges, unfortunately, is we tend to use email as an infinite storage mechanism. And so we don't archive and destroy information after a period of time, which means that if an attacker does at some point compromise my email account, they can get years and years of information. Okay, let's continue our conversation. So email fraud, so we've talked a little bit about email compromise. Email fraud is really about going after the money. And billions of dollars are stolen across Canada and the United States annually via business email fraud. And it's everywhere from small amounts. My local elementary school PAC was targeted and they were only seeking about $700 in a kind of business email fraud scenario to very significant amounts. And there have been business email fraud stories that have been in excess of tens of millions of dollars. In fact, this is something that impacts not just small organizations, but also very large organizations. Both Facebook and Google recently won a lawsuit against an organization that defrauded both of them for in excess of $100 million via false invoice fraud, which is a variation on email fraud, which is very, very common. The one that most of you will probably be familiar with is kind of payment redirection and also wire transfer fraud, where a payment was already planned to be made to a legitimate vendor, and somehow changed information is inserted into the communication, and then the payment ends up being deposited somewhere where it was not intended, and the criminals make off with the money. And so those are, kind of very commonly in the press, and they're attacks that are very successful a lot of the time. And so those are a form of attack that we're going to talk about today in one of our case studies. So case study number 1, self-discovered compromise. So in this particular case, an alert user detected an unusual sent message in their outbox. They were probably reviewing their sent messages just to see if another message had been sent successfully. And they noticed a message that they had not sent. And that message contained an email and username for their email account being sent to an unknown recipient. And so when we think a little bit about how this may have occurred, the likely source that we determined was that the device had been compromised via malware, and then that malware leveraged the fact that it could send an email unnoticed via the email account to a third party. And then that third party could then use those credentials to then log into and compromise the account. And in fact, our further investigation showed that they had an active login from an external geography and IP address that they had not previously accounted for. So one of the nice things about a lot of systems, Office 365, G Suite, et cetera, is it'll show you kind of where systems are being logged into from. And so, you're normally based out of Vancouver or San Francisco, and that's where you would expect to log into your accounts from. And, an account access from somewhere like Turkey is unexpected. And so that showed that there was an active session that allowed that third party to have access to the email box of the compromised user. And so, we had to do a forensics analysis of that email box to find out what sensitive data was contained. We cut off the external access, cleaned up their credentials, reset their accounts, did further containment. And in doing investigation, we discovered that this employee had a number of sensitive records, and it was primarily employee data, right? So they had to go and notify about a dozen different internal employees of the fact that their social insurance number, address, name, birthday, all this sort of stuff that can be used to perpetuate identity fraud and identity theft had been potentially compromised. And they went out and purchased some identity protection on behalf of their employees as part of that. It's never a good day at the office when you have to inform your employees that as a result of insecurities and failure to adhere to best practices that their data has been compromised. And unfortunately, it is all too common. So that's our first scenario. Scenario number 2, a blackmail attempt. So in this particular case, the first indication that something had gone wrong was a request by a blackmailer for a Bitcoin payment. And so they provided evidence by email of a compromise with sensitive data from the executive. And so we went in and did, again, some discovery and forensics and determined that, yes, indeed, there were actually, over a period of time, a number of different unexpected third-party accesses to their account. And we did a more broad organizational sweep to see if there were other indications of compromise. Unfortunately, it had been limited to the one set of credentials. In this particular case, the executive, unfortunately, had a bad habit of reusing the password. It was not a very strong password. And, it was also a password that had been compromised in a recent credential breach that we were able to confirm via Have I Been Pwned, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And so the likely source of this particular attack was a credential stuffing attack. Despite the fact that MFA had been rolled out to a lot of other employees, it was not on the executive's account. And as I mentioned, there were these active connections to other IPs. And so, there was a bunch of containment that was being done, but there was a very significant cache of client records and other financial data back to the mailbox. And so as the blackmailer kind of continued to up the ante and, insist on payment, all of the information we were able to correlate back specifically to that mailbox, which helped us provide some additional confirmation that it was not likely to have been compromised through some other means. So blackmail is becoming increasingly common in these sorts of attacks. And so it's not just that the data is compromised, but they feel that they can often get the businesses to pay directly to prevent the breach of that data to public sources, knowing that there's a number of fines and jurisdictions and other stuff. Organizationally, even if you are able to get the blackmailer to release the data and not release it to the wild, but delete it and all this kind of stuff, which is hard to confirm, whether or not they're actually going to delete all their copies, you still have an obligation under the Canadian Privacy Acts and a lot of other privacy acts to disclose that breach. And so the blackmailers are kind of counting on this devil's bargain that you'd be willing to pay them and kind of bury the fact that you've been compromised, which is, not in adherence to law. And so, generally, when you have these sorts of breaches, one of the things that you want to do is you want to make sure that you're engaging counsel and you're running your forensics and your investigations through counsel so it's protected by privilege. But you're also taking the appropriate acts as it relates to disclosure so that you're following the law where necessary. The third case study is a payment redirection. And so business email fraud, unfortunately becoming increasingly common. And, I hear about this, unfortunately fairly commonly. And so in this particular case, it was an amount of about $150,000. And it was a business that had a supplier that was a regular supplier that they worked with on a regular basis. And so payments went back and forth. It was kind of somebody that they worked with, on a very common basis. And, these sorts of payments, $100,000, $50,000, $150,000 were not uncommon as well. And so there was an early email account compromise that occurred before the business email fraud. And the attacker lurked within their environment for a while. So they were able to see who was communicating on a thread of messages, who the recipients and senders were likely to be. And they registered a lookalike domain for the supplier. So, it was the same as the domain for the supplier, but off by a single kind of character. And they sent an email that appeared to be coming from the supplier. So they spoofed the address, and the recipient's email was not configured to prevent the spoofing, unfortunately. And so they combined this kind of concept of social engineering with, the fact that they were already live within the customer environment. And they used a very classic mechanism that we're seeing a lot these days with suppliers is our current account is under a bank audit, so it's frozen. So we need you to make payment to this other account over there. Unfortunately, in this particular case, that payment was made, and the organization had some reasonable financial fraud protection policies. They just weren't followed because they were a known and trusted supplier, and it was on a thread, and everybody looked like they were the same people who had been communicating, throughout the week about the payments and the details and all this kind of stuff. It was just one message inserted. Fortunately, they determined that the payment had been made falsely relatively quickly, and they were able to get in touch with their bank fast enough to stop the money from being transferred beyond the first hop, and were able to recover the funds. So that's a good news story. And one of the things that we often say about security is the faster you can respond and have an effective response to an attack, the more effective you're going to be. So those are our kind of three case studies. Before I move on, if you have any questions about the case studies, you can ask me in the Q&A panel, or I'll continue to answer questions as we move along. So next, I'm going to talk about the lessons learned from each of these different attacks and defense strategies that we think about and we want to apply with our clients and when we're talking to others around business email security. So the first thing you want to do is focus on the protect aspect of your email account. If you can prevent somebody from compromising your email account in the first place, it's going to have a significant reduction in risk and impact. And so there's a few control-based protections that you can implement. One of them is educating your users. One of the least expensive, most effective things that you can do in terms of reducing the risk of cybersecurity breaches and compromises is end user awareness security training. Doing that annually, but also, having mechanisms to update that on a regular basis so that you're keeping security top of mind and they're not clicking on phishes. So things like online awareness training, phish testing, monthly emails, or maybe part of your communications to your staff, can really help your users kind of be less likely to fall victim to phishing. And don't assume just because your users are smart or technical that they're less likely to fall on phishes. We do phish tests on all sorts of different organizations. And some of the most technical organizations are the ones that fall for it the worst. They just kind of assume that their controls are in place, or they fall for the traditional social engineering attacks that we're all, unfortunately, a little bit subject to. Anti-malware technology is also a good mechanism for protecting your device and the email account on your device. And so that's a good way of protecting your devices from compromise. And yes, even if you're a Mac shop, anti-malware is just as important there as it is on Windows these days. Filtering out the bad stuff so it doesn't get to them in the first place, right? So if you can cut down on the amount of spams and phishes that are being received by your users, that's obviously going to have a big impact and reduce the risks. And so two specific examples are over-the-top filtering. So this is filtering that goes on top of your Gmail or your O365 or your Exchange server beyond what's built in, because the built-in stuff is good, but it's not great. And then also enforcing some things like anti-spoofing. A lot of organizations are starting to cleverly put banners, external messages, so that when people are pretending to be internal, that they're at least being identified. So those are a couple of techniques that can be very effective. And then really importantly, as part of awareness training, is training your financial officers on transfer best practices. And I'm not going to dive deeply into it here, but my personal favorite one is, always validating any new or change of payment instructions out of band, right? So if an instruction comes to you by email or by, a third-party portal, that somebody phones to a known good phone number or uses a Slack message that you may have with the party or some other mechanism out of band, so that if the email account has been compromised, you still have some other mechanism to verify that the banking information is correct. And so out of band, opposite direction is a good way to think about how you validate financial payment information, especially for anything that's a significant sum. So you can, if you want to be a little bit looser, not necessarily require that policy all the time, requiring it on payments above, I don't know, $5,000 or something that's appropriate for your organization can be a good measure as well. Password managers, I mentioned earlier that even in 2020, a lot of people continue to reuse passwords and they use them across multiple sites. And, as security professionals, we've actually created some of these problems ourselves. So we require things like 90-day password rotation, which is, increasingly not becoming the industry best standard, is not to rotate passwords often, but instead allow people to have more secure passwords and use multi-factor authentication and password managers to require less rotation. So having unique passwords for your different services where you don't have single sign-on or other forms of single authentication is a great mechanism. And increasingly, I'm seeing a lot of organizations roll out tools like 1Password, LastPass, et cetera, enterprise-wide to enable their users to be more effective, especially with online services. So if you're not IT and you're on this webcast, I would recommend talking to your IT department before using LastPass, 1Password, et cetera. But if you're an IT department, this is a really good mechanism, especially as we move to more and more adoption of cloud services. We don't always have the benefit of single sign-on technologies. And then on email, I consider email up with banking one of the most critical accounts that you have within your suite of accounts. And so there's multi-factor authentication. It would stop 95% of the attacks that we see around business email compromise. And there's different mechanisms of multi-factor authentication. So I'm going to take a minute to talk about each of them. So the one that is most commonly used is SMS because it's easy. Everybody has a phone. I get a text message. I punch in the code. The downside with SMS is it's becoming increasingly easy to compromise people's phone numbers. For about $40 on the dark web, I can go and get your phone number ported to my SIM and basically be able to intercept that second factor, use it for account resets, those sorts of things. So in my opinion, SMS is better than no second factor, but you should never, ever, ever use SMS as an account recovery option because that allows somebody to use SMS as a way they can compromise your phone number and then steal your account. We use at Kobalt, and we have a lot of other customers that are using this, authenticator apps. So these are very, very popular. They run on your smartphone. They churn out a unique six-digit code. You run one app and it has tokens for all these different services that you might use. There are some risks associated with authenticator apps. One of the most significant risks with authenticator apps is you lose your phone and then you no longer have access to your second factor. And so when you're setting up your authenticator app, you have the ability to set one-time recovery passcodes, but they need to be stored somewhere securely off your phone. And so that's something to consider. Generally, if you're going to be rolling out Authenticator for all of your users, then you want to make sure that you have at least 2 administrators who have access to the underlying system, so that if one of your administrators gets locked out, the other administrator can recover the first administrator. So you have a way to recover accounts that don't require you to have to go back and prove your identity to the vendor and stuff like that. And then for very serious mission critical applications, physical tokens are also another scenario, a technology that's not so widely used, but is very popular amongst the security paranoid like myself. And so YubiKey is a popular example. Google has a product series called Titan. And so it works very similar to authenticators in that it communicates with your device and with the backend service. The backend service has to support the token, so not everyone does, but it's a very, very secure kind of something I know and something I have kind of second factor as well. So I'm going to launch my next poll here. And again, as I mentioned, these are entirely anonymous. And so my question for you is, how strong is the security on your email account? And again, this is multiple choice. So you can choose multiple options if it's appropriate for you. I'm really excited to see, so far we've got 7 out of 9 people, 8 out of 10 people that are using multi-factor authentication. 10 out of 12. It is certainly a biased audience because you're here attending a security webinar, but that's fantastic. Good to see. I'll give it just a second more for a few more people to respond. Okay, I think that's a pretty good response. So let me end that poll and share the results. So this is very promising. So out of 13 respondents, 11 of you are using either an app or a token on your email accounts to protect it. That is fantastic. That's going to prevent the vast majority of email compromise. And then somehow we have, I guess you can use both SMS and an app. It's possible in some scenarios to use both. Usually it's one or the other. So as I mentioned earlier, if you are going to use SMS as a second factor on an account, just make sure you go into the account settings and ensure that it's not set up as an account recovery option, because that can be very risky. And then about half of you have a unique password, and about half of you have what you would consider to be a very strong password. So those are good results, and generally those are going to help you reduce your risk. So thanks for taking the time to enter that poll. So we've talked about protect. First thing we want to do is protect our email accounts to prevent them from being compromised. The next thing we want to do is talk about some of the mechanisms we can do to detect compromises should they occur. And so here are some examples of things that we've used quite effectively. And so within your logs and alerts, you can trigger and gather information on GeoIP or geographic mappings of IP addresses. And so being able to correlate who is logging into my email systems and from where allows you to find outliers that are unexpected and provide early indicators of an account being compromised. And I've seen a lot of SOC teams use this very effectively. It becomes actually one of their primary alerts of, is an account being used by somebody that I don't expect? A very sophisticated attacker will only access your account through a VPN tunnel to an area where you are believed to inhabit. But many attackers are very lazy. They'll compromise your account and they'll continue to access dozens of compromised accounts from Eastern Europe or Turkey or wherever they happen to be. And so GeoIP is a great indicator of compromise that we use very extensively when we're monitoring for our clients. Have I Been Pwned is a fantastic site run by Troy Hunt. And it's a free service, although there's commercial options available as well. And you can go in and you can put in your business and or your personal email accounts. And anytime one of your email accounts is found in a dump of credentials that are part of a compromise on the web. Troy updates that into a central data set and sends you an alert. So say, for example, you're using Etsy to buy, cool things, and Etsy gets owned. You may not have read the news that Etsy was owned, or you may not have gotten a notification from them. But as soon as that shows up in the dark web, Troy will send you an alert. And personally, I find this really entertaining because it turns out that I've signed up for services that I don't even remember, and I get alerts. It's like, oh, I didn't even know I was using that service. And it's also good for like, when should I go and rotate credentials and stuff like that. You can enter it for a bunch of people in your organization. So if you have password reuse habit problems in your organization, it allows you to get an early indicator that something is wrong. Generally speaking, monitoring authentication activity across your organization is another really good detection technique, right? So it lets you see things like brute force attacks and other sorts of mechanisms. Tied together with GeoIP is a really good detection mechanism. And then another service that we use, we have an automated discovery service for our customers' domains, and we can also use it where they ask us to for supplier domains. It allows us to look for registered phishing domains, right? And so an example would be, you've got acmeanvils.com, and they'll register ac.meanvils.com as a phishing domain as a way to target your organization, or they'll leave out the I in anvils or something like that. And so we use this DNS twist tool that allows us to automatically detect new phishing domains that are registered against your organization. And then you can use those lists to block on your mail server, be extra vigilant with your users, because they're usually early indicators of somebody trying to target you with a phishing campaign and those sorts of things. So those are some detection techniques that can be very effective to help you determine that something has happened early on. And then lastly, response, right? So, we're protecting our email accounts to the best of our ability. We're detecting when something's going bad, but being able to respond in a calm fashion, in a measured fashion, in a fast fashion is the difference between really life and death as it relates to some of these compromises. One of the things that we say in security is it's not so much about, having everything locked down to the nth degree, because, a really determined attacker will always find a way in. But being able to detect it and being able to respond to it effectively is going to dramatically reduce the cost and impact of an attack. So be prepared, then act is kind of our motto. So do you have an incident response plan, right? So if you were to have a significant security incident, do you know who's in charge, who you call? Do you have a retainer with a third party so that if you need help beyond the capacity of your organization, you have somebody that you can reach? If you have an end user who has a systems problem, is it going to be easy for them to reach IT or security? Are they going to feel comfortable doing that? If they see a phish, do they know what to do with that phish? Do they ignore it? Do they delete it? Do they inform IT? And so making sure that that is documented and is understood, especially as it relates to business email fraud, being able to get in touch with your banker very quickly and stop that transfer from going onwards is critically important. Only about 50% of the initial transfers actually make it to their eventual kind of criminal masterminds. A lot of times we hear stories of the money got taken out and redirected to somebody else, but we got to it in time and we were able to stop the money from being lost. It did cause somebody, a week or two of grief, but it's a week or two of grief when they save themselves $150,000 rather than losing the $150,000. So knowing that and documenting it and being prepared to respond is really, really important. Identify and contain your attackers, right? So looking for things like connected sessions, right? So where do I have sessions that are connected from an authentication perspective? Do I have 5 different sessions that are connected to a compromised email accounts from 3 different devices that I don't know? If so, can I kill those that even as I clean things up, they're not able to continue to siphon emails and communications? And other indicators of compromise like the GeoIP that I mentioned earlier. Eliminate your risk of lateral movements, right? So this is things like resetting accounts, right? So if an account's been compromised, wiping the account credentials, setting it up clean, in many cases, like setting up 2-factor authentication as well if you can, if it's not already there. Making sure that you're managing your devices, sometimes if they're infected with malware, wiping them, that kind of stuff. Understanding if there's potentially admin accounts on those devices that could have also been compromised. And then fundamentally, knowing what's really going on is important as well. And this is, we work very closely with forensics partners, and they love working with us because we can look through log files and start to put together a narrative of an attack very, very quickly, which allows you to get a much better sense of, what's actually occurring versus just making it guesswork or having to spend hundreds of hours digging through a lot of data. So my last poll of the day. And, oops, apparently I was still sharing my last one. So the last poll of the day, are you ready for an incident? So here's some simple questions. And again, it's multiple choice. You can pick multiple answers if you like, and get a sense for where you are in terms of your preparation. In the last 6 months, we started conducting tabletop exercises of our clients with their incident response plans. And those are incredibly enlightening experiences. We try to provide it with a mix of technical and executives. And the reason we do that is because you get a much better understanding across an organization about what's actually likely to occur. And so a recent example that we went through is we had helped an organization develop an incident response plan, brought it to the tabletop exercise, and the technical team brought out a whole different incident response plan that nobody was even aware it existed. We've seen other scenarios where, honestly, people mill around for the first 30 minutes trying to figure out who's in charge, who's on first, who owns the incident, before they're able to make any actual progress. And that lost time could be really important as it relates to dealing with security breach. And so I think we've given people long enough to vote. So let me just end that poll and share the results. So as you can see here, a good number of you have got somebody who's designated, so an internal team or individual who's your prime, which is fantastic. 60% of you have got a documented incident response plan. Having it down on paper, it's important. The key is having an incident response plan that's actually going to be effective for you, that you're going to pick up and use, but it can help you kind of calm and collect yourself and have a bunch of information in one place so you don't have to go digging for it when the time comes. Where's the 7x24 number for my incident handler? Who's my legal counsel? Those sorts of questions, having them all in one place. And almost half of you have got a retainer with a third party. Some of you may not know this, but you may have a retainer not necessarily through a third party directly, but through your cybersecurity insurance, which is becoming increasingly popular. And only 2 out of 10 of you have conducted tabletop drills. And so I liken this to fire drills. Most organizations that I talk to that have got a reasonable sized staff will conduct a fire drill once a year. And in reality, in 15 years of running a business, they're not likely to ever encounter a fire, but they never conduct a security tabletop exercise, but they're probably likely to encounter a significant security incident at least every year or two. So, it's well worth spending a couple of hours with your team to go through that exercise. All right, so let me close that poll. And we're just about at the home stretch here. So how Kobalt helps. In a nutshell, you've kind of got a hint of it from a lot of the things that I talked about before. And fundamentally, what our business is about is helping organizations assess. So this is like understand where you are today, develop, build, and put the right controls, practices, policies in place, and run your cybersecurity program. And so that could include security monitoring as a service, helping you roll out awareness training, helping you with architecture, those sorts of things. And so, we match our services based on your current internal capabilities and your needs, and try to be an effective partner to you in helping you get, better security outcomes for a reasonable cost. And so with that, I'd like to open it up to any closing questions. You can use the QA button at the top. And thank you very much for joining us today. Hopefully you learned some things and you found it useful. All right, well, there don't seem to be any questions. I will send a link of the recorded version of this webcast. So if there's anyone else in your organization you'd like to share it with, you can do so. And thank you so much for coming along today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.